Welcome back. This time we're talking about Legion, Season 1, Episode 7, Chapter 7. Now, I said in my review for Chapter 6, and I have to admit that was a pretty long-winded video, that episode had pretty much been one of my favorites so far, kind of exemplifying everything I really love about Legion, from the writing to the characters and the acting to the production values as I sort of kind of clump it all together. Between the sets and costumes to the music choices and cinematography. Now, if that episode was the setup, existing literally within a fraction of a second of actual time, Chapter 7 was the payoff, both for the action and narrative momentum that we get in this episode, as well as the revelations that we get about what exactly is going on in this show. Namely, David and his parasite, who actually finally gets a name in this episode, Amar Farouk, the Shadow King. Now, exactly who he is and how he relates to our other characters, who definitely seem to know who he is, we still don't know, but just having a name really kind of grounds a good bit of this show and gives us a foundation to build off of moving forward. And to me, that may be the most important thing that we get out of this episode, is that foundation where we can start building our knowledge of what is going on and where this show can go moving forward. Now, to quickly sum up what actually happened in this episode, of course, we had the cliffhanger of our characters trapped in this astral plane creation of the mental hospital that's pretty much been taken over by Lenny, or now the Shadow King. And Oliver had invaded this space, rescuing several of our characters and laying the groundwork for a counteroffensive, which is what happens in this episode. And our characters ultimately escape, with the exception of Walter, who was killed by the Shadow King, as well as the telekinetic, who I'm not 100% sure, because I honestly thought female Carrie had died a couple episodes back, but it does appear that he probably has died. Although before he did, he was able to save Sid and Carrie. And male Carrie was able to put the halo on David, thereby at least temporarily trapping the Shadow King. But before they have time to really celebrate this victory, or at least work to extract the Shadow King permanently from David's mind, the Division 3 agents show up, of course, at the worst possible moment, and they include the interrogator that we had from the first episode, who had, up until this point, was presumed dead. They're only interested in David, and as the agent points out, the rest of them can be shot where they stand. But before any new bullets can start flying, we see internally inside David that the Shadow King is starting to crack her cage, and of course that's when we go to credits and we get yet another cliffhanger. I think this may be one of the only shows I've watched where for 7 straight episodes, every single episode of this show has ended on one type of cliffhanger or another. Let's talk about our villain, because as I said earlier, he has a name. He is the Shadow King, Amar Farouk. And that name is first given to us by Oliver when he's talking to male Carrie. And it's very obvious that Carrie recognizes the name. And I actually wrote in my notes to point out the expression on his face. To me, it was either concentration or abject horror. And really, those two expressions with that actor are not too dissimilar, because he is a very expressive actor. So I don't really know for sure. It's probably a mix of the two, but it was definitely obvious that he recognized the name and knew who Oliver was talking about. That part of the equation we still don't know. Who exactly is this Shadow King, and why do Oliver and Carrie, and presumably the others who have been living with them, know who he is? As we not necessarily learn, but presume during David's internal conversation with his rational mind, that something happened to the Shadow King, that his biological father most likely defeated him, and in sort of a Voldemort type of way, only his consciousness survived and later returned to infect a baby David. If that's indeed correct, and everything that we know up to this point, that David has been possessed since a small child, that means whatever knowledge they have of the Shadow King and whatever encounters they may have had with him had to have occurred prior to that. So we're looking pretty long into the past as far as whatever connections that might be. And speaking of that conversation with his rational mind, that was another scene that I really loved in this episode. I love the chalk animation and how they kind of just set out some things. I mean, you could say it was a little heavy on the exposition, but really that we haven't had a scene like that up to this point. And it was nice to kind of just take a break and summarize what we know. There weren't a huge number of revelations. It's pretty well in line with what I've been discussing from what we had learned in previous episodes, that David's father had some kind of encounter with what and now we know is the Shadow King, and that in revenge or just because he saw him as a powerful mutant, infected David later in life. We still don't have any real new information on who his father was or is, the same being for his mother. I did have to laugh at David's rational mind having a British accent because it's his rational mind. It also allowed actor David Stevens to give us his honest accent, since he is British, and also give us his attempt at an American faking a British accent, which was doubly hilarious to me, at least. I did find it a little interesting that David himself named Sid and his interactions with her as the catalyst for breaking him from his previous subjugation, for the lack of a better word, to the Shadow King, and that's why the Shadow King was forced to act, because really Sid gave him a reason to live his life on his own, for his own. And speaking of the Shadow King, something else that we learned is no matter how powerful he may be, he can still be trapped. And that's what they're able to do with Carrie's halo. Essentially putting her in the same box that David had been put in by him. That's going to get confusing. Although, of course, we see at the end that he is breaking out. What we didn't get to see was whatever Carrie's plan was to be to try to exorcise the Shadow King completely from David's mind, because they're interrupted by the Division 3 agents. And that's as good a segue as any. Moving on to the Division 3 agents, we see that the interrogator, and I'm sure he has a name, but considering I thought he was dead, I really didn't spend much time trying to figure it out in the first episode. Obviously, he's alive. He obviously took a good deal of damage during that attack. There was a lot of fire during that attack, and it's not really clear to me who actually caused the fire, because of the people that we saw during that encounter. We had the telekinetic, who ever since then has not shown any kind of ability with fire. It was Sid, and that's not her power. We saw autonomy, and that was not his power. And we saw female Carrie, and that we had not seen that that's her power at all either. So what caused the fire? Was it just, traditional ordnance, or was someone else there that I'm not recalling? I'm not sure, but that is a question that I don't have an answer to right now, and maybe something I missed. So if you know, please let me know in the comments below and tell me, because I'm really not sure. And speaking of the telekinetic, as I've mentioned in previous reviews, I don't believe he has actually been given a name. And I probably could look it up on IMDb, but I'm always nervous about doing that, because I might see episode totals, and that could give me a clue on who might or might not survive. So I try to glean as much information as I can out of the episodes themselves, and as far as I know, he has not actually been given a name. But he did have his moment of heroism where he is able to save Sid and Carrie from the Shadow King after the Shadow King kills Walter, who I'm going to continue to assume is the name of Afro Guy, as I used to call him. And that was as about as brutal a death as we've had in this episode. And I'm going to include Lenny, if she actually did exist at that point, being stuck in the wall, basically being crushed to death, first inside the astral plane, and that eventually affecting his real body as he's just bleeding out while time is frozen, and then just getting crushed once time resumes. It's not that there was so much going on in that scene because we didn't know if the bullets were going to kill somebody, kill Sid, kill David. It was hard to concentrate on everything, but that was such an intense moment. And he was definitely a creepy guy. I probably don't want to know what his plans were for Carrie once he caught her. But as we see later in the episode, her that encounter definitely affected her, and she holds some very harsh feelings towards male Carrie for leaving without her when he was recruited, for the lack of a better word, by Oliver. And it was actually something that I had recorded for my review for episode 6, but cut just because that video had gotten so long. I did find it interesting that he went after Sid and not Carrie first. We never saw that he was specifically asked to start with Sid, but he never goes to find Carrie after waking up Sid. He kind of puts her on the duty to rescue everyone else. But considering the bond that they have, I did find that interesting that he didn't do that, and it's obvious that he's been called out for that decision. There's definitely some friction in their relationship that wasn't there before. Now, I've been tiptoeing around the ending because I want to talk about that last. And there's one other thing I want to talk about before I get there, and that is the time frame in which this series is set. It's been purposefully vague, and because of the costume decisions and some of the set designs, I've really been thinking that we were looking at probably like late 70s, early 80s as when this show is taking place. We've not had any concrete evidence one way or the other, and I really haven't been looking for little details or potentially, anachronisms that the producers may have missed if they were indeed trying to set it in that time frame. The reason I bring it up now was during the conversation with David and Amy after they escape from his mind in the astral plane. She's wanting to contact her husband, and David's talking about how they can't do that for fear of alerting the Division 3, which turns out was a moot point. But she mentions how she would at least like to email her husband. Now, obviously, the presence of email gives us a defined time period in which this narrative can be set, and that's not the late 70s, early 80s. So exactly when this is taking place, I now have no clue, but it's obviously much closer to present day than I assumed. And now finally, I definitely want to talk about that whole sequence where the episode essentially turned into a silent film. The show has already toyed with the idea of silence. It was actually something that the Shadow King used against our characters when they were attempting to rescue David in his childhood home, that precipitated everything that's happened over these last 2 episodes. So it's interesting that he once again resorted to silence. Although here, because we get the silent film-esque voice screens, dialogue screens, it's not clear whether they actually can hear each other or if that's just for the audience sake. Now, the whole thing where they use those voice screens and everything might take the, trippiness a little too far, but considering this is taking place in an astral projection and basically being controlled by mental powers, I really don't have a problem with it. It worked really well. And what really helped is I love Bolero as a musical piece, and both the idea that was what was being used as well as the version that was in this everything worked so well. This was one of the most tension-filled 10 minutes of television that we've gotten in this entire series so far. I mean, it's spot on, perfect. And just the little touches, like when the Shadow King goes to, I guess, the real world and knocks out Oliver, and we get a actual sound for those few moments until the Shadow King sort of regains control, and we're right back to where we were. Just the black and white with them wearing the glasses in the astral projection, them seeing the sort of the zombie type other patients whenever they're not having the glasses on, Carrie kind of fighting them off after Walter knocks her glasses off, and Sid's dealing with what she's having to face, and knowing that right behind her and she can't hear, is just, there's so much tension because, again, we just don't know how willing this show is to kill off characters. So there is a high level of tension when we have these moments. And then with them escaping and back in the room, and then we still don't know what's going to happen with the bullets, and they spin around, and they did fake me out that I really thought David might have been shot. I don't expect him to be killed, but it was very possible that he might be shot at that moment, and then we see that he had caught the bullets. But that whole sequence, like I said, that is probably my favorite 10 minutes of this entire series so far. And just a perfect example of why I love this show. And now just to sum up things, we did get to see a new version of David. We've seen his passive, beaten down kind of personality that he's kind of been forced into by the Shadow King. We saw him being slightly more hopeful, but still passive as he's getting treated by Dr. Bird. Then we got to see the downright creepy, overly confident David that was actually the Shadow King, pulling the strings. And in this episode, once he is able to break out of the prison and he's trying to escape the sort of the memory jail that the Shadow King has set up for him, trying to escape and help his friends, it's sort of the confident David, but a nice, confident David. And that's a version that we haven't seen before, and I really enjoyed watching. And another thing I'm a bit curious about, I went into a lot of detail about the personification of David's sister Amy in the astral plane as she was the nurse. And in this episode, we see the Shadow King kind of interrogating her, trying to get more information about David's life, looking for a specific thing. She actually said she's looking for it. Like there's a thing in addition to David himself that she's looking for that might have been given to Amy's family when they adopted David. What exactly that is, we don't get any other clues. But that is something that we should keep an eye out for moving forward. So again, this was a great episode. We learned some very interesting things. We got a name for our villain. We got some forward momentum in that our heroes are now out of the astral plane, although they now have guns pointed to them in the real world. The Shadow King is at least temporarily blocked, although the last few seconds of this episode would pretend that that's not going to be a long-term situation. And we also lost our primary, aside from the Shadow King himself, villain in Walter, who had been a very interesting character and one that we never really did get to learn too much about. And that is kind of a shame because he was a very interesting character and a pretty cool villain. But I don't see him coming back from what happened to him. What did you think of this episode? What did you think of the revelations as far as the Shadow King and what it might mean moving forward? Do you have any idea of what you might think the item is that he was looking for while he was interrogating Amy? And do you have any answers to some of the questions that I posed that I honestly don't have answers to? Like who created the fire in the first episode, as well as did we ever learn the name of the telekinetic or the agent that returned in this episode? As always, you can subscribe to my channel, check out some of my other reviews, and until next time, see if your rational brain has a British accent.